this is Vivica Williams. Welcome, and you're watching Head to Head. Today we're talking about the ongoing persecutions of Crimean Tatars. Recently in occupied Crimea, the Kremlin-controlled Yalta City Court sentenced Crimean Tatar human rights activist Yunus Masharipov to 4 years in prison. This is only one of hundreds of cases of repression and harassment by the occupational authorities in peninsula Crimea. To discuss this and other human rights violations in the occupied peninsula, we welcome to the studio today Denis Savchenko. He's a deputy director of the NGO Crimea SOS. Hello, Denis, and thank you for being with us today. So let's talk about these cases that have been going on now. Specifically, what happened with Yunus Masharipov?
Mr. Masharipov was involved into activism. He gathered information about different violations conducted by the so-called local government on the territory of Crimea. And they were not only related to human rights violations, but also kind of common, like the garbage on the streets or unrepaired roads. And all of this information was transferred to the Ukrainian mass media or representatives of the state authorities. By doing this, Mr. Masharipov, he became the threat and a person of interest for so-called representatives of law enforcement authorities in the territory of Crimea, and as well as many other people in Crimea. He became the target and was persecuted legally by so-called court.
And what kind of charge did they have against him to be able to charge? I mean, they do, of course, frequently just come up with the most, insane ideas to be able to charge people and sentence them for long years in prison. What were the charges they brought against him?
Actually, the occupying authorities, they have kind of a system in providing charges against residents of Crimea, especially Crimean Tatars, because they have to build up this kind of image of extremists, terrorists, and just misconduct doers. When we're talking about this person in particular, he was charged with possession of explosive substances and kind of guns.
And this is very easy to be able to plant, or not even just to say that this was, without providing evidence to just show up with some type of materials.
Well, the process of all these legal actions taken against Mr. Masharipov, of course, they are not controlled by any independent authorities, and they are not supported by any independent mass media. So yeah, in general, the so-called law enforcement authorities, they can do whatever we want. We had quite the similar case of Vladimir Ballou, who was openly expressing pro-Ukrainian position in Crimea. He had like Ukrainian flag, and the street mark near his house, and he was charged with possession of ammo for guns, and it was there is a suspicion that all these illegal items, they were just brought by representatives of so-called law enforcement authorities with them.
Right. When they did the search, they just put these items in the house. And this, of course, I mean, the Crimean Tatars are the most outspoken, have been since the illegal annexation, since before that, the most outspoken and pro-Ukrainian on the peninsula, which makes them the biggest target by the government. And as we see now, there's just more and more activity of criminalizing just the very essence of what it is to be a Crimean Tatar. And this is when we come to talk about the Majlis.
Yes, the so-called Supreme Court of Republic of Crimea adopted a decision according to which Majlis of Crimean Tatar people was considered as an extremist and terroristic organization. This decision then was disputed into the international court authorities, which provided the corresponding decision that the decision of so-called Supreme Court of Crimea was illegal and has no legal basis. But what we see now in the territory of Crimea, that despite the provisions, despite the actions of international court authorities, so-called local government still persecutes and put Crimean Tatars, especially those who have active political and social position, under different kinds of pressures, and the main tools that they use are the policy of terror and fear.
Right, and this is just a very general law. I do recall when Russia passed this several years ago. It's just such a blanket and open law which allows them basically to prosecute any dissent. And now when it comes to the Majlis, there was the recent announcement that the occupational authorities there intend to nationalize Majlis property.
Yes, this is true. This is like the profound step of both Russian Federation, Kremlin, and local so-called local governments. Firstly, they limited the basic rights, right of speech, right of any human rights activities, activism. They banned the majority of independent mass media. They foreseeably made the majority of Crimea residents to enter the Russian Federation citizenship. So there were many processes, and now they came to the point when they can substitute different entities, including patriotic representatives of Crimean Tatar people. This is what we see now in Crimea. And to support the allies, the collaborants, they indeed nationalize, just grab the a different kind of estate and businesses, and then give them to loyal, yes, representatives, residents of Crimea, or even
classic Soviet technique.
Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm. And we saw this in different kinds of operations that Russian Federation was involved in.
And we also see it seems to be a concentrated effort to destroy the Crimean culture, the Crimean people, because not only do we see this attempt to end the Majlis, which is this representative body, but also the destruction of historical cultural sites that have been there for more than 1,000 years, that are a part of the Crimean Tatar people.
Not only to destroy it, but to substitute it with something artificial that could provide the image of Crimean Tatars, of all the ethnicities living on the territory of Crimea, in a light that is suitable and comfortable for the Kremlin. And yes, we can talk about the very famous Bakhchisarai Palace that is being in accordance to local, so-called local authorities, that is being reconstructed, being repaired. But we identified many cases of destruction of a very valuable parts of this palace, and this is just one of the situations that we identified.
Could we see parallels between what's happening with the Crimean Tatars in occupied Crimea with what happened in Chechnya? So, just for our viewers, Chechnya in the 1990s was just was looking also to receive independence. Outspoken, very people who are very culturally tied to their culture and history as Muslims, as Chechen people. And of course, there were two wars against this, the one where Putin was just violently putting this down. And we saw the installation of people of Chechens who were loyal to the Kremlin, and this massive destruction there and oppression in the Chechen Republic. So it seems like there's a lot of parallels when it comes to how that Russia has learned how to deal with entire peoples who are are opposed to them?
Well, there are similarities, but there are things that are very different when we are talking about the situation in Chechnya and the situation in Crimea. Of course, Russia used to apply quite similar tools to oppress the local population on the territories that they are interested in. And in general, when we are looking at the territory of Russian Federation, there are very different ethnicities, right. There are very different nations, but the general policy that Kremlin applied towards all the territories that they are factually controlling is assimilation, substitution of local population by loyal representatives of the mainland of Russian Federation, and we see that in a very different spheres that Russian Federation brings not only people but the culture or in some cases its absence to the territories that they are controlling. So this is the common thing, but the approaches, of course we should remember that there was a long-term and very cruel armed conflict on the territory right. of Chechnya. The annexation of Crimea was not bloodless, as Kremlin wants to state. At least 2 Ukrainian military men were shot to death during the events of annexation, during this military operation, and we observed that this was military operation too, but the scale of these operations are uncomparable.
Right. Some we see of the after effect of attempts to pacify and control the population. There are some similarities there, and we also can talk about just in general this detaining and repression. And what have you found out about the number of Crimean Tatars who are currently being detained?
I would even talk about the pro-Ukrainian population that were persecuted starting from the 2014. We have some numbers. I would like to stress on the fact that these numbers can differentiate based on who you ask about them, because there is no common approach talking about them. But we have 98 cases of criminal persecution of disloyal population, and the majority of these cases are about the Crimean Tatars. We have almost 300 cases of administrative punishment applied to different residents, in majority to residents of Crimea, but sometimes to people who temporarily came there. Mm-hmm. And the majority of them are either administrative arrests from 3 to 15 days or administrative fees. And there are 44 persons that became the victims of enforced disappearances on the territory of Crimea. These are only those cases in which we could prove that there was involvement of local so-called law enforcement authorities. 15 of these people, the whereabouts of 15 of these persons are still unknown.
And what are some of the most difficult criminal cases that are going on now? I mean, this is just really tragic. We see the continued persecution. And just in general, to speak, the cases you bring up, the numbers you speak up, are only the ones we know, only the ones that have been taken to court. And it's very difficult to get information. And I know, how are you able to get information? We know that Crim Realities, the news organization, is still operating, but it's quite difficult for them.
Indeed, there are no, as I've been already telling, there are no independent mass media that we could rely on and that we could receive information from. Our organization has the direct contact with activists, for example, representatives of Crimean Solidarity. These are mostly relatives of victims of human rights violations, including political prisoners. Representatives of our organization go to Crimea in monitoring visits to talk with directly either with relatives of human rights violations victims or with them, because some of political prisoners were already released or being in the process of court hearings and maybe under the house arrests, so we can reach them directly. The other important source of information are activists. They are civil defendants. These are lawyers, professional lawyers who on their own risk try to provide legal assistance to political prisoners. And those are civil journalists, the non-professional journalists who took on the role of journalists and who tried to provide information about all the illegal activity of local authorities. So we try to maintain permanent connection with them in exchange of information, and we try to talk about them. We try to speak about them as much as we can to provide more light on their activity, and therefore to provide at least some degree of protection from the side of international community, because in case no one talks about them, they are totally unprotected.
Right. If they disappeared, yes, exactly. I understand what you're saying. And then, is there anything to give us hope?
Only hard work and really not giving up, because we should remember that this is not kind of a chess game when the other side, the opponent, waits until we do our own step, take our own turn. So of course we should unite. We should remember about these people, about this territory, of course, and do what we can. Both the government of Ukraine, of course, who takes the ultimate responsibility over the situation in Crimea, and including the representatives of civil society who was very active starting from the very beginning of the conflict, and who have much of expertise and experience and tools to somehow contribute the situation. But what is very important, that every person just mentioning the situation in Ukraine and those people who suffered from the consequences of annexation and military operation on the east of Ukraine, they can somehow contribute this too.
Thank you so much, Denis, for being with us today. Thank you for bringing this insight.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Denis Savchenko. He's a deputy director at the NGO Crimea SOS. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV for more great programming.